we're going to make this a little bit more formal because the camera is here. But I want to say first that I'd like to thank Florian for inviting me, and also Dr. Bailey for inviting me here, because it's a real pleasure. This is part of what we do in terms of knowledge mobilization, in terms of spreading or talking about the work that we have done. But before I begin, I want to acknowledge the indigenous people, and especially the Algonquin Anishinaabe nation, who currently, I believe, has a lawsuit against Ottawa, against the city of Ottawa. And also my research team of my two research students who are here, graduate students, Nicole Taylor and Bipasha Sultana. So they've been with me in this whole project, which has been a really intense project for a number of reasons, aside from the fact that it deals with death and dying. I want to say a little bit about the impetus for this project, because I always like to situate where the project comes from and also situate my own standpoint. This project has a kind of twofold spring, if you want, that sort of led to it. One was research that I had done looking at obituaries and the representations of First Nations women's obituaries in the Globe and Mail. And that research actually had its origins in the work that I've done around race and representations, particularly in terms of how racialized bodies are presented generally, how they're presented in particular contexts, how they're presented in crime stories, how they're presented in the courtroom, how they're presented forensically in terms of after death, and how they're presented posthumously in a way, in terms of their obituarizing or their memorializing. So how do these bodies get framed in each of those contexts? So this work actually sort of has its origins in the work that I've done around the missing and murdered women, in terms of the representations of these women in the press, and then the representations of their bodies in the courtroom, particularly around the trial of Robert Pickton, and then the representation of them in the obituaries after. So tracking that sort of trajectory, if you want, one of the things that became very clear is that with these women in particular, there was very little representation of them before. What representation existed tended to be very negative, portraying them as women who were purposefully putting themselves in dangerous situations. And then the representation of them in the courtroom, a forensic kind of representation, was of them in using a Gambon's term, as abandoned bodies, as bodies that could be killed with impunity, and as bodies in terms of body parts, so not even whole human beings, just body parts. And then looking at them in terms of the obituaries, that was the interesting part, was that over a period of something like 35 years, I only found 14 obituaries of First Nations women, Indigenous women. So that goes to show that kind of sort of absence that's there throughout. And when that absence becomes a presence, how it's contained and framed within a particular mold. The second impetus for this work actually comes from this book, which I had the pleasure of writing a preface to. This book is actually produced by the Book Collective, the Book Project Collective, which is based in Ottawa, and it's part of Diane Marjorie's work on women's history. And doing this work made me realize how many stories that the women that wrote, submitted their stories to this book, how many of them actually referenced their mothers who had passed away, talking about the earlier struggles of these women. And the book itself is really interesting because it charts immigrant women's contributions over a period of time, but looking at it across the decades in terms of what the women experienced and what kinds of contributions they made. So this spoke to me in terms of this notion that historians talk about of little histories, and the idea of little histories as something that can through accumulation and accretion in a body, actually capsize grand histories. Grand histories are those histories that are written about by the nation in its literature to represent itself, kind of like the histories that are embedded in obituaries. But the accumulation of these little histories can actually create a surge which can impact that grand history. So this project actually comes from those two areas. Now, this brings me to this area of thanatechnologies. In looking at the representations of First Nations women and the lack of representations in the mainstream press, one of the things I was struck with is how much of that lack was sort of compensated if you want, by their representations online. So a lot of these groups were actually creating online memorials to represent and memorialize, mourn, and remember the women that had passed away. So this brought me to this area of thanatechnologies, which are technologies that are around death, that concern death, but really in terms of the enactment of death rituals in the digital sphere, the offering, in a way, bringing people together so that they can circumvent things like expenses that accrue when you want to go to a funeral but can't go. And also the whole sort of notion of memorializing, how we remember people. And one of the things about thanatechnologies is that they actually can be grouped around three different sort of segments, which are not mutually exclusive. There are thanatechnologies which are ante-mortem, before death. There are those that are peri-mortem, around death, or when death is happening. And then there are those that are post-mortem, which is after death. And there are different kinds of technologies that occur at different areas, even though they overlap. So around ante-mortem technologies tend to be more around digital legacies, the protection of digital assets, stuff like that. The same thing happens around peri-mortem technologies, which can be wills and all kinds of other technological devices that are used in terms of preparing for death. And then the post-mortem is a lot of this has to do with memorials and memorializing. So they can be broken up into these three areas. Now, our project actually was mapping this whole area of thanatechnologies. What's out there, what can be easily accessed, and this is what we found using a Google search engine. And the idea was not to have a customized web crawler, but to find something that other people could easily find. And so our findings were that there are 95 virtual graveyards, 17 virtual graveyard mobile apps, 20 pre-death services, 14 post-mortem or posthumous digital technologies. And this is sort of like the terrain of thanatechnologies that exists. Before I'll just talk about this for a moment. When we were trying to figure out what these different graveyards, because our biggest concern was not to drown in the literature and not to drown in the stuff that was there, but to actually be able to take a step back and organize it. And so this was a loose organization. We came across like individual CyberMemorials. Many of these were around sort of like famous people, celebrities, but also specific kinds of losses. So parents who had stillborn children, for instance, or whose children had died, suicides, they would all go into that area. The other one was institutional memorials or CyberMemorials that were around sort of like the veterans, the war veterans memorials, things that were created by government or major organizations that were, commemorating their dead. And then the third category, which is again a loose one, are social movements and NGOs. So the missing and murdered women's memorials would actually go in there, because they're coming from the community and they're generated that way. I would say some of the other memorials that are from victims or the bereaved of, say, families of people who died during the Boston Marathon or 9/11 or 7/7 would actually fall into that area as well. But they're generated and created by social movements, organized social movements. And then you have those memorials that are clearly just around major tragedies like 9/11, but that are also created with more organized groups, like more state level groups. So the 9/11 War Memorial, for instance, would be part of that. It doesn't go into the social, because it's not really an NGO that's created it. That's not to say that these are all sort of like mutually exclusive. They're not. And one of the things that we came across was that many of these virtual graveyards actually operate as charities. So they work in that as charities that would be classified as NGOs. But that's a loose gathering. The next point that I want to raise is the features of these graveyards. But before I get into that, I want to sort of pull out something that I think makes a lot of sense in terms of organizing this material, and that is, you can break these graveyards down in terms of universal features like grieving, around platform-specific issues. So what are they placed on? Like, what are the platforms that are being used? And the third thing is specific losses. And that kind of speaks to the grid that we were talking about before. But if we were to go into the micro-level features of these graveyards, what makes them so popular? One of the biggest things is it's a vernacular. It's memorializing in the vernacular. And I often use the example of the vernacular as opposed to the spectacular, where the spectacular can refer to things that are generated by the state, for instance, huge monuments, huge memorials. The vernacular is more about like the everyday reality. People who are common, people who would not necessarily be obituarized because they're not famous. They haven't made any huge contribution that society knows, nor are they notorious in another way, which are usually the criteria for obituaries. The thing about virtual graveyards and posting memorials on them is that they're very flexible. You can go there anytime. Anyone who has some access to a computer, who has some knowledge of web literacy, can utilize them. And you can go and write about things that would be categorized as disenfranchised grief. Grief over a pet, grief over a lover who is gone, grief over things that one is not necessarily supposed to grieve about. So disenfranchised grief refers to grief that is actually not considered socially acceptable to grieve over, those areas. And the thing about these graveyards or these particular memorials on these graveyards is that they actually enable the formation of a community. So other people can go to that same memorial and post stuff, and that over time it can accrue, into a profile of the person, but also it can get changed and it can be updated and so forth. And the final thing is that they're very therapeutic, because what they do is they actually give expression, a public expression, to what is usually considered to be a private emotion and the private sort of experience of grieving. So there are four different sort of like issues that emerge, which I want to get back to after. But here we've just summarized them. One is the continuing bonds theory, which has informed a lot of this work. And according to this theory, the idea that one should only grieve over a particular period of time, and say, for instance, the 2 weeks that you're allowed to grieve by the state or by even a university, is not necessarily enough to actually allow you to grieve. It's not enough to come to a point of acceptance about somebody who has left. So the idea is that that those bonds with the deceased continue over time. and that there should be a vehicle or some form which allows for the expression of that. And one can see this actually in these memorials, because oftentimes they're written directly to the deceased. And oftentimes they're addressing the deceased in terms of, major milestones that one has reached through one's lives. Like, for instance, I want to tell you that I've just had a daughter, or I've just graduated. So they kind of sort of allow people to have an updated kind of continued relationship with the deceased. The second thing is, with the digital, with the continuing bonds theory, is that grief changes over time. It doesn't necessarily always stay the same. There are surges to it, and it can recess, and it can rise again. And so that was another sort of element about these graveyards, is that they would allow for that kind of continuity and that change over time, which is very important. The second issue that came up was the one of inheritance in terms of what happens to one's digital legacy. And we've seen examples of this in terms of how Facebook has tried to deal with it, and technologies that have come up that allow one to actually go in there and close the accounts of people who have passed away. But more importantly, I think, is the element of what one writer calls the algorithms of cruelty. And that is what happens to these digital assets which haven't been claimed, but which are then used by different platforms to generate combinations and permutations, which actually render those experiences quite different from what they are. So, for instance, in a couple of examples that were presented about these algorithms of cruelty, one author talked about having continually being exposed to his dead daughter's pictures on Facebook all the time, reminding him of her death. That was one issue. But the second thing is another sort of very quintessential kind of example that was used with reference to Google's particular technologies about assembling pictures in ways that create these momentous peak experiences, or are attempts to recall these peak experiences. So this author talked about going to his mother's funeral and driving across in Italy, driving across the countryside, and really thinking about that and grieving over it. And the pictures that he had put in his account, his Google account, were then assembled to present these very painful memories in a very happy, momentous way. So it's the conversion of that. And this kind of links up to another area, which is how, in fact, the existing technologies on these platforms tend to package all information, whether it's traumatic, whether it's sad, whether it's frightening, into these sort of contorted assemblages that actually point to very happy occasions. And so the idea of this, you can see the neoliberal logic that's embedded in that, in terms of, you're supposed to be happy all the time, and these are, memorable moments, and that's the only time you would actually record them. And but when you put them on these sites, they do get sort of like jumbled and put together in ways that are coherent, but coherent within a particular framework. The third element is the economic costs of grief, and that there are a lot of costs are associated with grief. And even in doing the work in terms of accounting for those costs, we were only able to touch on a few things, like the sort of like issues around mental health, issues around taking time off work, issues around the gender costs, because women tend to be poorer and widows tend to be a lot poorer upon the deaths of their spouses. So all of these sort of like economic costs around health, around well-being, around productivity, around poverty and so forth, have a gender dimension, but also are issues that are not normally factored in terms of how these technologies may help alleviate some of these. How do you allow for a person to continue grieving and yet be well enough, that process, that therapeutic process of grieving would then allow them to actually come back to work in a way that would be better suited to them. And then the last element is the costs and the ephemerality of virtual graveyards. And this is something that Wendy Chun has talked about in terms of the tenuousness of anything that's technological. But here, it's the idea that for these graveyards, you often have to pay $50 a year, or sometimes, if you get a special, $90 for 3 years. And there, the issue is that many of them say that they're going to be around, and so people upload all kinds of sort of like mementos and stuff like that, only to find out that subsequently they've disappeared. So they're kind of evanescent in that way. And that is a danger, because if you've invested a lot in creating a memorial, then what happens when that particular graveyard disappears into the ether? So if we go back to the idea of the therapeutic, because this is one of the main platforms around this research, is how do these technologies work in a therapeutic way? And part of it is that what they do is they actually strengthen relationships amongst the bereaved, the people who are left behind. And they bring communities together, cyber communities, who can provide each other support. And this is very clear. There's a network called Grief Online, or the Grief Network, which actually has all kinds of other clusters operating within it around specific losses. And people come online to talk about their experiences. And through that exchange of information, they also learn coping mechanisms and how best they can deal with the loss. And this becomes very important in terms of allowing people to not only be able to express the grief, but also to be able to get support. And these networks last for a while. And here I want to just use a quote from Medrell, who talks about this ongoing and active remembrance, because she says, the dynamic and interactive character of virtual memorials allow them to be updated and to provide ongoing and active remembrance, at least in the medium term, as well as in the possible sense of continuing bonds with the deceased and the shared community between mourners. So, memorials on social networking sites. One of the things that we did find in our extensive literature review is that a ton of work has been done around particular platforms. Things like Facebook. Facebook has generated the most research, but there are other platforms as well. And one of the things about that is that not only is it comfortable for those who are feeling grief and who are marginalized, and this is particularly important for the groups that we're interested in looking at, that are impacted by issues around race, gender, violence, who have the deceased in their communities who have passed away under, say, for instance, traumatic circumstances, say fleeing as refugees, being imprisoned elsewhere. So these memorials, these sort of areas actually provide these groups who are marginalized to be able to express their griefs. But the second element about these networking sites is the fact that you don't really need a lot of cyber literacy to be able to navigate them, because they have buttons. So for instance, in one of the examples that we had come across, like the Boston Marathon bombing, what people did is actually click on the like and the dislike. And so these buttons like would send a prayer, were converted into another kind of language, which was sending a prayer, and they're there to sort of like communicate expressions of grief and so forth. This kind of work, I think, in a way, these technologies allow for a greater involvement, because you don't have to be a witness to something tragic happening, but you can still show empathy for it. You can still express sympathy for it. And I think in that way, there is a humane side to this technology that sort of counterweighs, its more dark and sinister aspects. And I think that's important in terms of creating community. So when we looked at the expressions of grief online, there were a number of things we looked at. What are the visual dimensions of it? What is the lexicon of grief that's operating? And how is the language of grief actually organized? Well, one of the things that made it very different from looking at the obituaries, and because these are in a vernacular language, they're really emotional. You know, people talk about their emotions in ways that they would never be able to do in an obituary, that they would never be able to do in a eulogy. Things like "I miss you," "I love you," you know, were really constant. The other thing is that they're explicit. They're not so much implicit. So that emotional register is not only explicit, but the kinds of narratives that are told are also very expressive. And the other thing is that they're intimate. You often get people who are writing about grief in a way that is actually quite heartrending to see, and which does make you feel a certain kind of pain when you're looking at this. But I think that's really important in terms of this notion of prosthetic memories, which is something that Landsberg talks about. And the idea that through these kinds of prosthetic memories that we consume through media, we actually begin to get a sense of the loss that somebody's experienced, and we're better able to empathize with them. And as I mentioned before, it's a public expression of private grief, and it's the expression of grief over time. So we looked at the visual lexicon of grief that's there on these graveyards. And it's very interesting to see how different graveyards are actually organized quite differently. And some of them are very, very detailed and very elaborate, and others not so. But you have graphic interfaces like flowers, candles, teddy bears, champagne, balloons, all of these things to mark that kind of, you know, the feeling and the emotion. And I think this is really interesting in light of the fact that graveyards, the physical graveyard that's here, the very material graveyard, often doesn't allow for this kind of expression, which is very different. Like if I look at the graveyards in British Columbia, say for instance in Burnaby, or I look at the graveyard here in Montreal, one of the things that was very clear was that these graves were quite uniform first, but you couldn't, in Vancouver, in the graveyard, the cemetery I went to in Vancouver, you couldn't grow even flowers. It was prohibited. You could leave dead flowers there, but you couldn't grow anything. And you couldn't necessarily put teddy bears and stuff like that. Whereas the graveyards that I visited in London, in Pinner, the Pinner Cemetery, it was really interesting that all the graveyards that had graves of children had actual teddy bears there and balloons and, you know, hearts and all kinds of things. So what these virtual graveyards do is allow for an expression of those emotions that the physical graveyard constrains, much like a physical obituary constrains. And in that way, the expression, the range of expression that they allow is a lot more. So when we were looking at the lexicon of grief, we were looking also at the imagery that was there. And one of the early authors on virtual graveyards had noted that these were actually quite secular, that they didn't have religious trappings. But yet when we began to look at these images, one of the things that became very clear is that they're very Christian in terms of the kinds of images they bring forward. So this idea of bridges to the other side, the afterlife, the notion of innocence, the soul as having innocence, the idea of rejuvenation, or sort of like coming, growing into something new. All of these are very much part and parcel of that. The idea of, the shining light and the open sky. So we were more concerned with our main issue, which was how do we now begin to look at this and begin to trace these little histories that we wanted to track. So we looked at 4,000 memorials on one particular virtual graveyard, which is quite popular. And of that, we were only able to find 18, which is a very low number. So at that point in time, we were saying, well, is it a matter of literacy, media literacy? Is it a matter of cost? Is it a matter of access to computer technologies? Is it access to knowledge about online memorials? But then when we looked at a site that operates out of England, we noticed, in fact, that there were a lot more memorials posted by people of color. So clearly it wasn't a matter of culture that was the case here, nor was it really a matter of literacy, because a lot of, if you look at different technologies and who uses them, the fact that you can do a memorial on a cell phone would give you an indication that this technology is actually widely accessible and widely used. And if it's a matter of illiteracy, the fact that these memorials can be done with a minimal amount of illiteracy, because you can upload pictures, you can upload music, you can use the graphic interfaces that are there. So that clearly wasn't there. So the only thing we could really surmise was that people don't really have a lot of access to this knowledge. And they find access when there are no other ways to memorialize. So it's really interesting. Like, I was thinking in relation to this, the murders that happened of the Muslims in Saint Foy, at the mosque in Saint Foy. What happened as a result of those deaths is many of those bodies were actually shipped to other countries to be buried there. You know that the Muslim cemetery issue was a big issue in Quebec. And so the one cemetery that's there is in Laval, right? So now getting a body there versus getting a body sent back home is one thing. But the other thing is that what happens to those people after who've sent the bodies back home? And what happens to people who cannot afford to bury a body, given that cremation is actually a much cheaper alternative? So then you don't have anything tangible to hang on to. You don't have a grave that you can visit. You don't have any of those things. So this becomes a way in which all of those sort of absences, those lacks, can be addressed. And so if the question is not having access to knowledge about it, then the important thing becomes making such knowledge accessible. So I want to show you a couple of the memorials that we found on these sites that were around people of color and some indigenous people. And again, each site will have its own particular features. So this is very much like, your standard obituary. But these stories actually talked about, the stories of migration, about what these people encountered, about their struggles, all kinds of things that one would find in little histories to talk about. But there are other sites like legacy.com where the format is actually very restricted. So you can't say very much on these sites. So you actually have to go shopping around to see which site will allow you to upload pictures, which site will allow you to say more, which sites can you go to more often. And again, bearing in mind the fact that these sites are ephemeral, that's not always a guarantee that when you come back to it, it's going to be there. So when we went through the 18, we actually came across these features, these observations, which were sort of similar to the ones that we'd encountered before. The emphasis on growth and regeneration through the allusion to nature, the emotive references, and particularly in the ones that were racialized, the discourse of transcendence as well as exceptionality, which is very common even in obituaries. But here, the transcendence and exceptionality dealt with, people's struggles, like one particular woman who had come from the Philippines, how many different things she did, how she worked in one particular area, then changed her job or changed her retrained and became something else and worked at a hospital and what she did and so forth. But also the lineage. This is the interesting thing for me, was this notion that all of these memorials pertaining especially to people of color were actually very much sort of like insistent on naming all the children that had been left behind, where they were, and that sort of made me think about how this is a kind of sort of, in a way, it's like saying, I've contributed. Look, I've contributed my children. And look what my children are doing. So it was a way in which it speaks to virility and survival. The idea that there is a family tree and that there is this lineage, which also, on the other hand, talks about space, occupying space, but also a genealogy, that we're here to stay, we're rooted, kind of thing. So I want to end with this notion of the algorithms of death and bring it back to the issues, because I think these issues are, in a way, what kind of mars the picture, because we tend to think about these technologies as promising something, as promising a way out, as promising a more therapeutic intervention, and as something that people can hang on to. But when we think about algorithms of death, then we have to begin to look at what are particular platforms asking of people when they consent to actually uploading their information. So this goes into the digital rights issue, but also how are these technologies themselves, what are the architectural features in these technologies, the design features that are working in cahoots with an ideology that continually valorizes the positive and the momentous or peak elements versus actually the reality. So even in terms of interventions, if we think about how are we going to ask people to write their memorials, clearly we, if we want to generate these histories, then we don't necessarily just want the positive stories. We also want people to recount the painful stories, because that's part of changing that grand history. The other thing is and this is the digital property rights issue as well, which is the end user license agreements and costs. What are people leaving behind, and who gets it? Who has control over this? And is there something about these stories being copyrighted in perpetuity? Is it something that whoever owns that particular site then owns? And then the other aspect is the grief tourists and the digital trolls. Because one of the things is, yes, you can put a memorial up about somebody, but what if somebody hates them and comes along and decides to write something horrible about them? Who then works as the gatekeeper in looking at this? So there are, and there are instances of this happening. And then one of the elements is the continuous exploitation of the dead for profit purposes. This is very Foucauldian and actually draws from Carpy's work, which is the politics around that. So a lot of these sites actually set up these memorials, but every time you go to it, you also generate income for that particular site, right? Which means that your dead are actually being used to generate money for that site. So then what does that mean in terms of what the site asks you to pay for when you are, when you want to commemorate your dead? And the last one is a point that was raised, which is when these sites actually become obsessive. So somebody can't let go of their grief, and at that point in time just sort of continually builds a shrine around, an online shrine around this person who is then, who has been gone for decades, but the shrine is still there. And we've seen this even in terms of people who have a pathological obsession around with the object of their grief. So that's one thing to account for. But on the other hand, I'm also thinking about other sort of cultural traditions where it's quite common that every year you actually clean the graveyard or the grave site of the person, and that sort of marks it. And then other cultures that actually clean the bones every year of the person that's passed away. So, you know, the idea of something being obsessive itself is something that I think needs to be interrogated. But an obsessive in terms of what? A notion of a Western notion of the pathological. So all of these issues sort of like keep coming up through the course of this investigation. I'll end here and ask for questions. Thank you.
One of the things I was thinking of, thank you very much for that. It's really, what's interesting about it is there's a lot of things, but one of the things that really struck me was that it's a very specific area, but so many of the themes are things that flow through as everybody's working around what's technology and what are its social implications. So I thought that was really interesting, and I was thinking about the vernacular and how I think there was a very, at least, you know, from what I know about my sort of perception of Anglo-Saxon Christian approaches to death, the vernacular doesn't really have a place. It's sort of disdained, and so, and one of the things that always that is very graphic in my mind, or where you see, and this happened. I lived in the country most of my life, and so there were a lot of people who died in car accidents, and then there would be these little shrines that are built by the side of the road where the accident happened, as a kind of a vernacular kind of marker, expression of grief. And so this felt a little bit like that. And I don't know, those are just more observations, but it does start you thinking about what perceptions one works with when thinking about death.
There's a continuity, and in a way, you know, looking at this area, aside from the fact that it allows for networked communities, like cyber communities around grieving, and it allows for a level of expression that you don't normally see, it's very much, I would see it almost as part of a continuum. And in fact, Madrell's work deals with these very things, not so much the roadside memorials, but the park benches. You know, when you go into a park, you see a bench that's commemorating someone, or you know, you'll see something somewhere which will be like some kind of a commemorative thing that's always there. And so she talks about that in terms of the stones that are there in English countryside, the park benches, all of those things. So to me, it's almost like a continuum, and because of the imbrication of technology into life, the fact that it's saturating everything, so in that way it's going to saturate everything around death. And when we were doing this work, we came across numerous stories that were quite interesting. One was that of these graveyards, actually that Stijn Gotwed writes about, I think it's in the Netherlands, where they've actually put QR codes onto the stones so that you can, you know, scan it, and then you get to learn about all these, you know, whoever's died. But I also think that part of it has to do with what are the constraints around remembering. Like the vernacular emerges in an area, or is there in terms of areas that are not necessarily considered to be official or social, right? So it's in that realm. So what happens with the QR codes, I think, has to be placed within the context of that graveyard, is do all the graves look the same? And that's why it's important to have a QR code, because otherwise you're not going to be able to recognize that grave. And the second thing is, it's like one of my graduate students told me about her experience in Japan, is every year they go and clean the graves. There's a whole ritual around it. On a certain day, the families get together and they go and clean the grave. But what happens is all the graves look the same. So oftentimes, they don't even know if they've cleaned the right grave. You know, and there's always a running joke about that. But also, what do these graveyards, I mean, have they become so sequestered that they are away from the vernacular, which is what makes it so imperative for the vernacular to find expression on these sites? Because these graveyards seem to me really controlled. I'm talking about the material graveyard in terms of what's allowed, what's not allowed, how one conducts oneself at the grave, and the things that we learn also from the mass media, like the idea of leaving flowers, for instance. It's not something that one would automatically have assumed. It's something that one learns through exposure to all these media, or even what should a tombstone look like, you know, or the bigger the tombstone, the more you have, you're venerating the person. It's very interesting coming from another culture, because in our culture, when a person died, they were not put in a casket. They were actually wrapped just in a white shroud, right? And then they were buried directly into the ground, so that there would be no barrier between the body and the ground. You went back into the ground. And then there would just be a mound of earth on top on which you could grow flowers or grow whatever. And that was it. That became the permanent grave. Compared to a place here where if I go into, say for instance, when I die, if I'm buried there, then I have to, according to Quebec laws, have to have a casket. Even if it's a plain casket, I have to have one. Be buried with a stone, and whoever's behind, I don't know actually who I leave behind, my students maybe, who might want to say, okay, we're going to put we're going to put a marker over there that'll venerate her in a particular way. But all of these sort of like rituals, the constraining that's there, the rules around the graveyard, I think are also what's pushing people onto this. So there is a continuum, but it's like, where can you have the greatest mobility? Where can you actually go and choose your own graphic interfaces? Put up the kind of music that you want, the pictures you want. So I think that's working in concert with that. Mm-hmm. But it's very much a continuum of expression. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes?
I was wondering, I guess this is more a long-term question, but it would, with time that would change. Like, let's say, if I lost my dog when I was younger and I just created my Facebook account, I am probably going to post it on Facebook to say that I lost my dog. Versus now, I have, what I post on Facebook is way more limited, right? Versus what I used to post, 6-7 years ago or something like that. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering if with time, the age, like the fact that maybe a certain age group will grow up and maybe not post the same things that they used to on Facebook, and the fact that you said that something like Facebook is used
extensively, yeah.
I was wondering if that would maybe change with time, maybe with generations as
because before it used to be MySpace. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of work that was done on MySpace before Facebook. Now it's Facebook. But I think there is work that's being done on vlogs, there's work that's being done on Instagram. Mm-hmm. So all of these other platforms that are coming up, there is more and more work. But I think part of the platform is in terms of what it allows and disallows, right? So the attraction to these other platforms is in terms of the affordances that are built into the design of the platform. With Instagram, one of the things is the pictures. With other technologies, like one of the things that's happening even in terms of funeral industry is changing as a result of this too. So they're now allowing for webcasting of funerals. So you can actually have your funeral webcast so that, and streamed so that somebody who is on the other side of the world who can't be at your funeral can still be there, right? So I think it'll depend on what a particular technology, what kinds of affordances it has built in, and what it's going to allow or disallow its users.
Would you say that there's more people going towards social media for that, or to specialized websites, or vice versa?
No, it's like, I would say right now it's social media that a lot of people go to, a lot. And in fact on YouTube too, you have all these interesting, sites that are there that memorialize. But I would say if I were to choose in terms of which will allow you more freedom, then clearly some of these virtual graveyards I think offer more than a corporate run platform like YouTube or Facebook. Yeah. Yes.
In regards to new technologies and building a funeral, has your research touched on algorithms that sort of replicate the person? I remember
Yes.
Twitter. Okay.
Yes, there's a huge story actually that was in Wired magazine about a man who created a dead bot. It was his dad bot. And so he took all these elements and he created this bot, and he had the phone. And so his dad was with him. And what they had done before is they had actually interviewed, when they knew the father was dying of cancer or something, they had interviewed and they had gotten a lot of historical information about him. And then they had put this together into a bot. And he talks about carrying this phone around, this bot around, and talking to his dad. But at one point he says, "Dad, do you love me?" And the bot couldn't respond, right? So he talks about that kind of a lag, if you want, where you can have this remembrance and you can have all of this stuff, and we see this actually in a lot of sci-fi serials, right, where they create these kinds of things. But the thing is that person is never going to replicate that person, the person who's died. It's a remembrance, it's a reminder, it's almost like a walking memento mori, which are these reminders of the dead. Yeah. But there is work being done in that, and there's lots of really interesting and quite entertaining shows around that my students constantly tell me about. Are there any other questions? No? Well, thank you very much for coming and listening.
Thank you very much.